So those are those numbers. Now, the numbers that, again, that I think affect the majority of people that's going to watch this video is these numbers that I'm about to give you now as they pertain to the United States. And again, it is in these numbers that I start to call bullshit on much of the narrative and much of the indoctrination and much of the media propagation of material as it pertains to slavery in the continental United States. So we're going to look at these numbers the same exact way as we did with the other data sets. So in this case, we're taking our high number per year of 23,200. All right. And we're taking the amount of slaves of that number that actually was designated to be transported to the United States. And this was the number that was so surprising to me. And when it started to really resonate that the story that I had been taught and told and indoctrinated into was probably a bullshit lie, was here. And it was 2%. 2% of the 23,200 slaves that were transported each year in the transatlantic slave trade on the high end was designated for the United States. So what does that mean? What does that mean? That means that 464 slaves out of 23,200 slaves that were stolen from Africa was designated for the United States. So not even 500 people out of 23,000 were designated for the United States. Now, how does that translate? How does that translate when we start looking at the number that made it and the number that died in the Middle Passage? That translates as such. And I'm going to give you a range in this just so we can, keep it on a bubble. That first range, the number that was designated for the United States, that range is from 464 flat, 464 to 386. So a good year, America, the United States, got 464 slaves in there to be sent to box. All right. Now, that didn't mean they made it. That means that there was 464 to 386 slaves designated to end up in America. Now, after you subtract the low mortality rate of 12.2, on a good year, 407 slaves made it. On a bad year, 328, and that's at 15%. 328 slaves made it. Okay? On a bad year, 328 slaves made it to the United States. So between 407 and 328, that's how many that got to the port of call, to the port of debarkation, turned over to an auctioneer and placed on an auction block. And that's at any of the ports that are commonly known for accepting slaves or having slave auctions within the port. Ports like Boston Harbor, New York Harbor, Baltimore, Richmond, Virginia, Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans. These are all ports that were commonly known to have auction blocks where slaves were traded. So in all of a year, no more than 406 or 407 slaves were sold at auction in an American port. All right. Where in the transatlantic Middle Passage, inside of a year, between 69 and 47 slaves died. All right. Between 69 and 47 slaves died. So again, it's one of those things when you see these numbers, it makes you say, hey, Brother Tezwan, what is you doing? These numbers don't seem right. That number can't be right. And so I refer you back to the source. When you go look at slavevoyages.org, you'll see a lot of this same information. All right. And again, the most striking one for me is the number that shows you that only 2%, or roughly 2%, of the slaves that were taken from Africa actually made it to the continental United States. All right, was designated for the continental United States. All right, and that 2% holds, rather it's on the high end or the low end, it holds. It's pretty much the same. It's within the margin. So that is, I think, the most striking part of this is understanding that 98%, if the numbers, hold true throughout, 98% of the 42 million people that identify as black in America, or is identified as black in America, does not descend from people that were stolen and enslaved from Africa. All right. So if we don't descend from that, if 98% of us don't descend from that group of people, the question then lies, who do we descend from? And we'll get to that answer here shortly.